Dankjewel. En ik open deze hoorzitting en die gaat vandaag over Uber. En het is een hoorzitting met de heer MacGann. En hoewel Engels een van de 4 officiële voertalen is van het Koninkrijk der Nederlanden, is het volstrekt ongewoon om een vergadering in het Engels te houden. En toch kiezen we daarvoor vanwege onze gast. En ik hoop dat u daar begrip voor heeft. En we zullen proberen om achteraf een korte vertaling online te zetten. Maar we hebben geen simultaanvertalingen voor de mensen die meekijken. Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting today between the members of the Permanent Committee on Finance of the Dutch Chamber of Representatives with Mr. Mark MacGann, former employee of Uber. Warm welcome to you. You've travelled to us to answer questions and clarify your viewpoint on the fiscal treatment of Uber in the Netherlands. And the reason why we invited you are the Uber files and a number of newspaper articles. Also, warm welcome to Ms. Gibson, and she's the legal advisor of Mr. MacGann. And we fully appreciate that if you blow the whistle that you need legal advice. Of course, warm welcome to everyone who's here, to everybody who's in the room next door, because there were so many people, we had to have a second room, and then everyone who's listening from elsewhere. We have 1.5 hours and relatively few members of parliament, and that means that we have ample time. So I propose that first you give us an introduction. If you need 15 minutes, then you'll have 15 minutes, and then we have questions for clarifications. I'll just quickly propose or the members will quickly propose themselves to you.
My name is Henk Nijboer, financial spokesman for the Labour Party.
And I am Mayer Alkaya of the Socialist Party, spokesman finance, among other things.
Laurens Dassen from Volt, the European Party.
Mr. MacGann. And when you speak, please put in the microphone. And that means that people elsewhere can hear you, and the camera will zoom in on you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the invitation to the members of the Finance Committee. So I'm here today at your invitation to answer any questions you have following publication of the so-called Uber files last July. As you know, I was previously a senior executive at Uber in charge of public policy. And my main role was to convince governments and regulators in nearly 50 countries around Europe, Africa, and the Middle East to change the law to allow Uber to operate and be successful. So I am the source of these files, which came to light through an investigation that was jointly led by the Guardian newspaper and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And that was over 180 journalists from 44 media organizations in 29 countries. And they researched through more than 124,000 documents to reveal how Uber bullied its way into cities around the world, including here in the Netherlands. The files span a period from 2013 to 2017, and they unveil Uber's aggressive expansion across the world. And they show that we lobbied, just in this region alone, more than 1,800 politicians and officials in 29 countries, as well as many senior representatives of the European Union. The data shows that the company had easy access to prominent leaders, the company influenced governments, and the company avoided taxes. So why did I release this information? Why did I sacrifice my reputation, my career, my health, and countless friendships by providing the data to the media and assisting them with their work? Because, members of the Finance Committee, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about Uber. It's about the systemic failures that helped a company like Uber to take advantage of loopholes to get what they wanted to the detriment of drivers, of taxpayers, and even democracy itself. The reason I'm here today is to try and help prevent this from happening again. Now, I've been at the nexus of the worlds of business and government for almost 30 years. I was trusted by companies and their shareholders to convince legislators, regulators, and governments to propose, enact, and revise laws and regulations in the interests of private enterprise. And I'm proud of that career and of much of the work I accomplished. But in the minds of some, there's something opaque and underhanded about lobbying. And being a lobbyist is not always perceived as a noble thing to be. According to the dictionary, a lobbyist is a person seeking to influence legislators on a particular issue. And that's essentially what I did. And I continue to believe that skilled, ethical, regulated lobbying is a fundamental component of an effective democracy. It ensures that politicians like yourselves are well informed and can make decisions that benefit us all, companies and people alike. For this to happen, though, there have to be robust rules governing the interaction between the private enterprise and the representatives of the state, both politicians and civil servants. Those rules must be sensible, fair, non-discriminatory, and as beneficial to the public good as possible. What the revelations of the Uber files show is that the rules governing this interaction have broken down. They were not fit for purpose when Uber knowingly was breaking laws around the world. They remain unfit for purpose today. Uber bullied its way into countries and disregarded the law because it faced little or no real resistance. And I'm alarmed by the continued inability of the state, here and in many democratic nations around the world, to resist and refute unethical, immoral, private sector interests motivated not by the public good, but by profit and pure greed. So if you accept that lobbying per se is not the problem, then what are the practices that bring lobbyists into disrepute and allow companies to drive a coach and four horses through the law, as Uber did in those days? Uber's methods duped politicians and the public alike, with politicians often saber-rattling in the media, but showing far greater interest and cooperation in our private meetings. It was no exception here in the Netherlands, where the highest levels of government, having eagerly provided Uber with an immoral, unethical tax status, provided encouragement in our private meetings while instructing the Public Prosecution Service and other enforcement authorities to raid our offices, scare honest Uber drivers, and charge executives with criminal acts. It was very odd to witness the schizophrenic attitude of many governments, telling us directly and via the media that we were breaking the law, while at the same time trying to find quick fixes to let us into the market and hopefully generate tax revenues and create jobs and wealth. I say this respectfully, but I suppose there was a certain logic here in the Netherlands that the government would do everything in its power to protect and defend Uber, given the tailor-made tax arrangement that the Dutch state awarded in 2013. I should perhaps remind you that Amsterdam served as the base for Uber's rogue operations around the world. By bending over backwards to ensure that Uber located its international headquarters here in the Netherlands, the government and many state agencies often turned a blind eye to the harm that this Dutch-based company was causing elsewhere. The data that I provided to the investigative journalists shows how the Dutch state operated as a defender of Uber, routinely fending off concerns of other EU member states and advocating Uber's interests in meetings in Brussels, while here at home, the state harassed, fined, and humiliated citizens who were recruited by Uber to drive in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, and here in Den Haag. Democracies cannot function when those elected to serve the people engage in practices that are hidden from the public view and that are withheld from the public record. Despite many freedom of information requests, the Dutch government still refuses to reveal the sweet tax deal it gave to Uber, stating that information related to tax matters is confidential. Now, while this may be convenient for a government in the short term, in the long term, it will undermine people's trust in politicians and set the stage for history to repeat itself. It's not my place to lecture Dutch elected representatives. My role is to simply share what I know in the hopes that this knowledge will help lead to a solution. A fix that ensures our democracy is strengthened, not harmed by lobbying. I'm resolute in my conviction that the public interest is served wherever and whenever it is revealed that the common good was potentially sacrificed to the benefit of the powerful. And in those days, Uber was very powerful. We had unlimited, disproportionate financial resources and political influence. Like many big tech companies then and since, we were too big and too powerful for any one country to take on alone. That power was enhanced by weak transparency rules that allowed some politicians to hide their interactions with us. This is not just a Dutch or European problem, it's a global problem. Money continues to buy access and influence. I blew the whistle because I realized that I helped sell people a lie. And if people like me don't speak out, then there's no hope for meaningful reform. Unless politicians like you here in the Netherlands and around the world and in each and every EU institution take drastic action to establish ethics rules that prevent the type of behavior we will discuss today, then our democracy has as much to fear from self-inflicted wounds as it does from despots and autocrats with tanks and bombs. I would encourage the Finance Committee to push for regulation of lobbying that's truly fit for purpose here and at the EU level. And if you find what you read in the Uber files to be unacceptable, then please remember that such practices were made possible by a combination of ruthless greed and state failure, and that many companies before and since have succeeded in subverting democracy and the rule of law, again, with little effective resistance. We all win when we have robust rules. We all lose when those rules favor the powerful over the powerless. If I may add two brief additional points before I take your questions. First, in the case of Uber, drivers were directly harmed by the lax rules that allow Uber to lobby in secret, and that led to millions of platform workers in Europe being denied minimum social protections and basic human decency. I would encourage this committee and this Parliament to ensure that the Dutch government supports the draft European directive on platform workers that was adopted by the European Parliament, and to resist attempts by France and others to put the profit of companies like Uber before the rights of Dutch workers. Ladies and gentlemen, Uber trampled over European labor laws from its Dutch base, and it continues to do so today. Surely that must be a source of shame and embarrassment for those in this House who believe that basic social protections for workers are essential. How far will one government go to prioritize the race for foreign direct investment? The second of the 2 points is that since July 11th, 2022, I'm no longer a lobbyist. I have a new label, that of whistleblower, klokkenluider, which for some also carries a negative connotation. Whatever your position, it's imperative that we protect those who risk everything to come forward with public interest information. The European Union Directive on Whistleblower Protection that has finally, very late, been implemented here in the Netherlands. It's a start, but there is so much more that we can and must do to assure that those who want to speak up can do so without fear of retaliation. I was lucky. I had incredible support from the Signals Network, a non-profit organization that helped support me in my whistleblowing journey. Every whistleblower should know that this support exists, and every government should welcome this support for its whistleblowers. Nothing is more important to the future of democracy than shining a light on those who put our democracies in danger, those whose actions and whose greed weaken the democracies from the inside. Shining that light in large part depends on the courage of those who are willing to come forward and share what they know. We should do everything in our power to protect them when they do come forward. Thank you all.
Thanks for your clear introduction. And thanks for your very political statement. And yes, I, in my personal capacity as a former European rapporteur on whistleblower, I fully sympathize with that part of what you're saying. I think it's time to leave it to the questions to the members, and they can be somewhat detailed, and because we have all time to do it. Because for us, this is also mean to get some information for the debate which we have on Thursday with the minister or with the Undersecretary of Finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. MacGann, for your clear and very clear introduction. We talked with some people who work for Uber in the Netherlands nowadays, and they really underscribe the detrimental situation they have to work. As a social democrat, I think you have to have a decent life when you work hard. And then I heard about the wages, the working conditions, the safety conditions, but also when you get tips or tariffs, Uber doesn't act according to the Dutch law. And I want to ask to elaborate on that point also. Then to the point of this meeting, the fiscal, of the tax situation of Uber. Can you elaborate somewhat about the decision to put the Uber headquarters in Amsterdam, and what role the fiscal of the tax circumstances in the Netherlands and also the tax rulings the Dutch tax authorities had? What role did these issues play, and how is it compared to other countries? Did Uber try to debate with other countries to put their headquarters there? And what was the debate? And what were the circumstances that the Dutch tax authorities provide to Uber?
Thanks for the question. I should remind you that I am not qualified to speak about the detail of how Uber drivers are treated today, in terms of if you take a trip and it costs 20 euros, how much of that 20 euros does a driver actually receive in gross revenue, and once they've paid for the car, for the petrol, for the insurance, for parking, for cleaning, et cetera, what they actually take home. My knowledge in many European countries is that they rarely take home even the minimum wage in those countries where there is a minimum wage. But I think that the experience of drivers today is of huge importance. And there is this European law which is now being decided between the European Parliament and the Member States. So the Netherlands will be asked to take a vote on this in the second half of this year. And it's important that we maintain the presumption of employment in the current version, so that if you believe you're self-employed and you're your own boss and you want to be independent and you don't want to be an employee, then you have to go and get lawyers to show that this is the case. If you listen to Uber or other platform companies or even the French government, there should be the presumption of entrepreneurship, so that if you're actually being treated like an employee and being told what to do by Uber and you're not your own boss, then you, probably not very well paid, have to go and get a big expensive law firm and wait for years in the courts to get justice. So this new European directive, it's very late, but it's very important. Coming back to Uber's tax affairs, back in 2013, there was intense competition among EU member states, in particular the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, where I'm from, to attract these big global companies, in particular in the tech industry, to come and locate their headquarters in that country. Then and even now, sometimes politicians saw tech companies as a panacea for the social and economic problems that a country was facing. And we at the time said that Uber would create, of course, lots and lots of jobs. But we didn't use the word jobs because we wanted to make sure people knew that we would not hire these people or pay them salaries or pay for their social protection. But the Netherlands was successful. We used to say to the media that we located our international headquarters in the Netherlands because it's a great country. It is. People speak great English. They do, in the big cities, of course. It's very central globally. But the fact is that the tax deal that the Dutch coalition at the time offered was very hard to refuse. And it's on the public record in the media since 2015 that Uber managed to strike a deal to pay corporate taxation on 1% of its global profit at a 25% basis point rate. So 25% of 1% of global profit. And the other 99% of global profit would be diverted via the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas to Uber and its shareholders. So that was the deal that was struck then. Uber says the drivers want to be self-employed. Uber spends tens of millions of dollars trying to block reforms to support drivers. But in any case, the details of the taxation agreement, when we were approached by the media, we didn't go on the record, but we also didn't deny because the journalists actually had the facts. The role of the Dutch tax authority at the time, we saw the Dutch, when we were having office raids and people getting arrested, executives and drivers getting harassed and fined by ILT, the enforcement arm of the Ministry of Transport. We had the Dutch tax authority as our champion at the EU level. In the European Union then, I believe also now, there is a working group on taxation between the member states. And our ambassador at those meetings was the Dutch tax authority. And when we were getting a lot of criticism from the French in particular in France, because of the nature of our operations there, and from Belgium, the Dutch tax representatives would explain that our corporate tax base was here, and that the operations in France were just marketing entities, in Belgium was just marketing entities, in Spain it was just marketing entities. I think the facts that have been revealed since then showed that this was not true, that we did actually create intellectual property in France, where all of Western European operations were run out of Paris, not out of Amsterdam. All of UK Nordic operations were run out of London, not the Netherlands. But the short answer is that the Dutch tax authority was a very cooperative friend. The data shows. It's not about my recollection or what I believe. As the investigative journalists will tell you, it's about what the data proves or does not prove. And the data proves that we had regular, behind-the-scenes, off-the-record conversations with the Dutch tax authority. We knew what was going on in the EU working group on taxation. We knew what the French wanted, we knew what the Belgian wanted, and we had a very willing friend and ally in the Dutch tax authority.
And you talked about the corporate tax of 1% of the world income, and then for only 25% the tax rate, the Dutch tax rate, it's the usual tax rate. So it's 0.25% what will be taxed. And is that still nowadays, is that the tariff that Uber pays?
I don't know what the status is today. The very long article in Fortune magazine, which was published on the 22nd of October 2015, the title is How Uber Plays the Tax Shell Game. I think it's now behind a paywall, but I'd be very happy to pass it on to the committee if I don't get sued for copyright reasons. But we were consulted about this very in-depth investigation. We decided not to go on the record, but it explains the revenue sharing agreements, the IP boxes, et cetera, between Uber Technologies in San Francisco, Uber BV in the Netherlands, Uber CV, which is incorporated in the Netherlands, but with headquarters in Bermuda. This is the basis of, as you know, the reality of shell companies. But the Netherlands in those days was a very attractive, beneficial tax paradise for Uber's operations.
Do you have another question in this round, Mr. Nijboer? Mr. Alkaya from Socialist Party.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. MacGann, first of all, for being here, giving us the information, blowing the whistle, and also for your important opening statements. Now, what bothers me the most as a socialist is not only that it starts off with a tax deal which is very profitable for a multinational like Uber, but that the tax authorities continue to be cooperative in a way that you call them a champion, a friend, and an ally. Now, at a certain point of time, there's a multilateral tax audit, which the tax authorities, the Belastingdienst, of course, knows of. And there's also confidential information about Uber. And it is suggested in Uber Leaks that this confidential information, which is very valuable, of course, for Uber, the company, is being leaked by the tax authorities to the company. Now, can you elaborate a bit more on what happened there and how important that was for the company? Because the government now denies that there was some bad doing in that case. Can you elaborate a bit more on that situation?
I mean, the first thing I would say is, if you look at the out-of-court settlement that Openbaar Ministerie made with Uber to drop the criminal charges against Uber, this is March 2019. The actual briefing document from the Office of Serious Fraud of the Dutch government talks about these companies, Uber International BV, Uber Netherlands BV, etc. So you have information on the reality of Uber's structure in a different forum, still a part of the Dutch state. I would also encourage you to look at the questions that your colleague Paul Tang asked in the European Parliament and the answer he was given by the Executive Vice President of the European Commission with regards to Uber and the fact that Uber transfers all income outside the United States to a Dutch holding company and that its global profits are kept artificially low. So this is not the media speaking, this is Dutch politicians asking questions from the European Commission. The difference between the Dutch politician who asked the question and the European Commissioner who answered the question is that she knows the content of the tax ruling between the Netherlands and Uber, but you don't, your colleague Paul Tang doesn't, and of course the media doesn't. With regards to the cooperation, by looking back, you know, when I read in the newspapers that the Dutch tax authority had investigated itself and found that it did nothing wrong, I read that in the newspaper, and I don't wish any harm to the officials of the Dutch tax authority, but I was surprised that they didn't contact me to see if there was anything in these 127,000 documents that would be of value. When I look back into the several hundred emails that we exchanged internally here in Amsterdam headquarters and with San Francisco, there is a lot of data that shows what we were concerned by. We knew in advance via the Dutch tax authority what the French were asking for and what they would in the future do from a tax perspective in France, what the Belgian tax authority wanted from us in Belgium. So we knew this in advance. And what tax authorities in Belgium, France, Sweden, Denmark, other countries wanted in particular was what we called PDD, partner driver data. So we call drivers partners, partner drivers, and tax authorities would want the actual data, the names, the addresses, the driving licenses, the car registration number of these drivers in France, in Belgium, in Sweden, etc. So the authorities could go directly to these women and men and tell them, first of all, you're committing fraud, because if you're driving for Uber Pop, that's illegal. If you're not driving for Uber Pop, but you're driving for Uber X or Uber Lux or Uber Black or whatever it was at the time, you need to pay your income tax, you need to pay VAT. So the tax authorities, in my opening statement, I talk about the schizophrenia of some governments that were both enforcing against us and also telling us in private, whether it was the French Minister of the Economy or people here in the Dutch government, that they would help us. It was quite schizophrenic. But we knew via the Dutch tax authority what member states were saying, what their counterparts were saying, both on a bilateral basis and on a multilateral basis. And this information and the data was not invented by some tax manager in Uber's offices. It was based on a very close relationship that we had. And I know from experience in other European member states and other companies that when you have your foreign direct investment agency that does everything in its power to get you to come and put your company in the country, then they will continue to be a partner for you at the international level. And it was consistent, if nothing else, that the Dutch tax authority would be our best ambassador in the EU discussions on taxation. But the data shows, demonstrates, proves that we had a very close, convenient, cozy relationship on a day-to-day working basis with representatives from the Dutch tax authority.
Now, this is, of course, shocking. But how would you explain, how can you explain this, this culture at the Dutch tax authority? Do you think it's something specific that was something only Uber was getting, a way of treatment that only Uber was getting, or do you think that it was the culture that was very natural to them? Or how else would you explain that the leaking of confidential information, or the close cooperation and being such a friend of an ally of a multinational, which other tax authorities are treating in a whole different way?
I would say in general, when you do everything in your power as a government to get a promising startup that has $10 billion of venture capital money at a time when interest rates are close to zero, when you do everything in your power to get that company to come and locate in the country, and Uber said we would create lots and lots of jobs in the Netherlands, which never happened. We would bring lots and lots of taxation revenue to the Netherlands. I'm not sure that's ever happened. There's a certain consistency that certain agencies of the government would continue to support you and cooperate with you. I guess at the time that the Dutch coalition signed this tax deal with Uber, they didn't know that Uber was going to come and break the law in the Netherlands and in France and in Germany and in Italy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can't really speak to the culture within the tax authority. I can't speak to what orders they were given by the finance ministry or by the economics ministry, but there was definitely, let me put this another way, I wish we could have had the same cozy relationship, regular information, in particular about closed-door EU Council working group meetings. I wish we could have had that same cozy relationship with the Ministry of Transport and with Openbaar Ministerie with regards to the criminal investigation. Then it would have made life a lot easier. But all I can do is refer you to the data that I'm mentioning here.
Mr. Dassen.
Thank you, Mr. MacGann, for sharing this information. And I would like to continue a bit on what you said in the last part about, of course, the also shocking news that also the tax authorities were sharing information on partner countries with Uber, also regarding the Uber tax drivers. For me, the question is, why was it also important for Uber to prevent or delay that this information was being shared, and also by other countries? And also in that relation, also, did the Dutch tax authorities help with delaying this information request? And was it also shared how these other countries were planning to use this information?
Why was partner driver data important? We pretended to ourselves and to other people that we wanted to defend the drivers because they were the backbone of the company. Uber was built on the backs of the men and women who drove for Uber then and who drive and deliver for Uber today. So we didn't want them, and this is what we said to the media and to others, we didn't want authorities getting direct access to driver data because we thought it was unfair that they would get fined, they would have their cars impounded, they would get charged to the courts. And this is what happened to Uber drivers in many European countries. All of these things happened to Uber drivers. It was easier for organizations like ILT or the police to go after drivers than to go after the very wealthy founders of Uber sitting in San Francisco. The real reason, however, the truth about why we didn't want the French or the Swedes or the Danes or the Belgians getting access to partner driver data is that if those drivers were scared, were threatened, were fined, were humiliated by the police or by national authorities, then they wouldn't drive on the Uber platform. Then you have no Uber. And the data in particular is relevant for 2014, 2015, where you had this Uber Pop service that we said was a ride-sharing service. It was no more legal than snorters are in the Dutch language. But we knew that if governments and law enforcement was able to get access to the driver's data, then we would not have these drivers on the Uber platform. We referred to them as supply. We needed supply of drivers to meet the demand of the consumers who would pay for the Uber rides. The second part of your question is, so that's why we really didn't want the Dutch tax authority as part of the European coordination. We didn't want the French or the Belgians or others finding a way to get access to the data. And in some of the communications, some of the written communications or the meeting reports from our discussions with the Dutch tax authority show that the Dutch tax authority was successful in getting France and Belgium to delay going after partner driver data, which is what we wanted. So again, the correspondence, the data shows that with the help of the Dutch tax authority, we were able to, if not prevent enforcement authorities in some EU member states, we were able to slow them down.
Yeah, maybe a question on a different note is also because our Prime Minister visited Uber as well with Neelie Kroes. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the meeting that was being held there, what was being discussed, to get a little bit more insight in that conversation.
Yes, so you know, I was working with governments and regulators, as I said, in nearly 50 countries. So I wasn't always involved in the day-to-day relationship with the Dutch government, but we had some external lobbyists doing that, and we had some the benefit of some former senior politicians also having good networks to help us. When we were getting a lot of enforcement by ILT and getting the offices raided, and our legal director was taken away to the police station for a day, we were trying to find a way to get a better dialogue with the Dutch government, to tell them that if they could just see how consumers loved Uber, then maybe they would quickly change the rules the way we wanted the rules, and they would stop all this enforcement. The conversations I had with the Prime Minister's staff at the time in 2015, I was told, look, if ILT and Openbaar Ministerie is opening criminal cases, it wouldn't look good if we had a meeting between Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, and the Prime Minister Rutte at the time. It would just be a bad look politically. But then a couple of months later, on the 2nd of February 2016, we hosted, so Kalanick and I hosted Prime Minister Rutte and Mrs. Kroes in our headquarters in San Francisco. And that was a very positive, constructive, beneficial meeting. There's various meeting notes. The data has a full meeting report of this meeting where we got very positive encouragement from the then Prime Minister, even though in parallel we were still being enforced against. Drivers were being heavily enforced against by ILT and the police. And at that point, there was still an open criminal investigation by Openbaar Ministerie.
Can you share that meeting report?
So this is where I answer a question with a question. On Thursday, so in a day and a half, I have to testify to the French Parliament's Special Investigative Committee on the Uber files. Now, that is a committee with subpoena power. It is a committee with full judicial power. If you don't go, you get up to 2 years in prison and you get a big fine. And they are asking me to hand over a lot of data, which I am compelled to do. I believe, and that provides me with a certain level of legal protection. Now, I'm not afraid of getting sued by Uber. I mean, that was their first reaction when the Uber files were published. Their lawyers in the Netherlands wrote to my lawyers to say that they would sue me and I would get fined millions of euros. But if I was afraid of Uber, then I would never have come forward and blown the whistle. I have been formally recognized by the European Parliament as a whistleblower, so I have the protection of the EU Whistleblower Directive. I understand from the clerk and deputy clerk of this committee that this committee does not have formal judicial power, investigative power. But if you ask me to provide you with certain documentation, if you do so in writing, then I can promise you that I will comply very quickly. And then if you get sued or I get sued, I'm sure we'll find someone in the media to write about it.
Against the chairperson, I'll take that up to me if there are any documents to ask them afterwards. Do you have any more questions, Mr. Dassen? Okay, then. You just told that and the Dutch tax authorities slowed down the information sharing as much as they could because Uber wanted to slow down the information sharing for setting up UberPop. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. Did the tax authorities tell to Uber what France, the United Kingdom, and other countries like Denmark would do with the driver data in case they had them?
My recollection, and I can go back and look into the emails, because I was on either direct recipient or on CC to many hundreds of these emails from very senior people in San Francisco and from the tax team here in Europe. It was a constant cat and mouse game with tax authorities across the European Union, except of course here in the Netherlands, where things were very clear and had a clear legal basis, if not a clear ethical basis. But we knew that the UK was different. They wanted to go after the drivers for income tax and for VAT, because the rules in London and elsewhere allowed for Uber to operate. We didn't ever launch UberPop in the UK because we knew that the UK police were very serious and they would shut us down within a day, contrary to politicians in France, Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, threatening us through the media, but not actually taking any real enforcement activity. The French, again, wanted us to shut down UberPop. That was the Minister of Transport and the Interior Minister. I remember being summoned to the Interior Minister's office and being told by him on a Monday that I would be in prison by that following Friday if I didn't shut down UberPop. I can tell you UberPop was shut down in exchange for the Minister of the Economy making a quick reform to the system so that we could get as many drivers as we wanted. So the French they kind of wanted us to stop, but at the same time they also wanted the VAT payments and whatever potential income tax payments, but also Social Security, the so-called URSSAF, the state agency that's charged with making sure people pay their Social Security contributions. They knew that if we had tens of thousands of drivers in France at the time, they were not paying their Social Security contributions because Uber, this bunch of young guys from the US, was telling them, no, but you're self-employed, you're entrepreneurs, you don't have to pay income tax or pay VAT. Uber then became overnight a very responsible tax citizen by saying to governments, but if you want VAT from the drivers, don't worry. We, Uber, will be the tax collector. We will take the VAT from the driver after we have our commission, and we will be a tax collector and we will do the collection and remittance of the VAT. So that was what we did in those days. But we knew from our operations, our teams in Paris, our teams in London, and our lawyers, because we had very expensive law firms in all of those countries, including here in the Netherlands, we knew exactly what different governments wanted. And to give you an illustration, in the UK Parliament, the chair of the parliamentary committee that oversees Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, then it was Her Majesty, now I guess it's His Majesty, the part of the state that's responsible for tax collection, the chairperson of that committee, the Labour politician Margaret Hodge, she kept coming after Uber because she knew that Uber was doing more in London than just doing marketing. We were running dozens and dozens of city operations out of London in other countries. And when HMRC in, I believe, 2017 or 2018, finally realized that we were creating that intellectual property from the UK, and therefore we were liable for corporate tax, Uber informed the senior management in London that they had to all move to Amsterdam, which they all did, I believe, within a matter of weeks. So different jurisdictions wanted different things, and the UK, of course, was then a member of the European Union, was a member of this EU Council Working Group on taxation matters, and the interface or the buffer, the representative between Uber BV and its national operations on one hand, and the other member states on the other hand, were the representatives of the Dutch Tax Authority.
You've talked about a lot of informal contacts. Can you elaborate a little bit how these took part? Was it sort of a phone call? Were they informal physical meetings? And the reason I ask that is there's been an investigation of the Dutch Tax Service, investigating the Dutch Tax Service, not finding any problems with the Dutch Tax Service, which is no surprise. I've seen that happen more often. So can you, and I didn't find any notes there or minutes being taken. So how was that information transferred from the tax service to Uber?
The first thing I would say is that my belief is that the people hired in Europe to work on Uber's tax issues, the young taxation managers, were very competent, but I think they were probably used, instrumentalized, manipulated by the senior executives in San Francisco. But the tax team in Amsterdam were very diligent. Every time there was an informal or a formal contact with the Dutch tax authority or other tax authorities, there was a written report. Everything was put in writing, and for better or for worse, I was a recipient of those reports. So if it was a formal meeting, for example, I remember our tax guys went to meet the Dutch tax authority, not on current Uber operations, but on self-driving cars, which Uber had invested billions of dollars in. There were meetings between Uber and the Dutch tax authority on the potential taxation of that activity. There were meeting notes provided from that encounter. But on the fringes of that formal meeting, during the coffee break, people from the same Dutch tax authority would update our tax people on the other issues. So either it was a formal meeting to talk about our tax status in the Netherlands or the EU working group or this, that, or the other, but the feedback was never relayed orally. It was always done in emails for several reasons. One is that their bosses were in San Francisco, so you have a time zone difference. The second is that since the purpose of Uber was profit, and lots of it, the taxation element of Uber's operations was a very high-profile topic within the company and of critical importance, which is why very thorough, in-depth meeting reports were written and sent. So I don't know what evidence the Dutch tax authority was talking about when it told the Tweede Kamer that it had basically investigated itself and found itself to be innocent, but I can guarantee that the tax people at Uber BV were not inventing things. They were not making things up. They were not writing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports about conversations or meetings or phone calls or visits, including visits to our headquarters in San Francisco by the Dutch tax authority via the Dutch consulate. Everything was in writing, everything was accurate, everything was honest, and everything I believe to be true.
Thank you. I will be asking in that letter then to have a number of these meeting notes to give us examples, because they didn't say anything. In the last point you said there were meetings being arranged by the San Francisco consulate. There is one meeting where the NFA and the tax service meet Uber. What was discussed there? Is there a meeting note of that? And what other meetings were arranged by the NFIA with Uber?
So, Mr. Chairman, I shouldn't and I won't speculate as to what was said in that meeting in San Francisco. I was not in that meeting, but I do have in the data a very in-depth, detailed report of that meeting by the people in the meeting, and I know from memory that the names of the people from the Dutch Tax Authority and also external auditors who were present, I believe from EY. So I'd be happy to provide you with those minutes if you mention that in the formal request.
I will. Can I pass on to you, Mr. Neighbour? Any further questions? Mr. Alkaya.
Now, if I were to draw a conclusion right now, yeah, I will not yet, because the debate is also on Thursday, and I still have a lot of questions, of course, for the government. But if all this is true, and I believe it's true, and if the internal research of the tax authority says nothing wrong was done, then I think you're not a special case. Probably the tax authorities, this is the way they do things. This is the way they treat multinationals like Uber, and maybe Uber was kind of a specific and a special case because it was this new, hip and trendy, up-and-coming company with a lot of potential. But it could be that a lot more of these kind of relationships with other companies are also, it's also the practice. And you're a very experienced man in this field of lobbying. Do you think the Netherlands is unique in this sense? Have you seen this way of cooperation, this way of interaction between government and multinationals elsewhere? Or was this the only case that you think in the world was that you experienced it in this way?
So you say I'm experienced. I